back with yet another fun-filled episode, Season 6, Episode 3 of Talkin Thrones, entitled Oathbreaker. I think this is the only episode that we get that's like an opposite of a title that we already got, because famously we got Oathkeeper in Season 4. I don't know, Pat, what are your thoughts before we get started?
Hey, listen, I think the Talkin TV family, Talkin Thrones with us here today, would love to hear Heartbreaker by Mariah Carey. Right, that would be definitely a great addition to the show if Mariah just came in and was going for that throne.
I think if Mariah Carey had come into this show, I think the world would have ended, and the show would have ended a lot sooner than it did originally. All of that and more on today's episode of Talkin Thrones. My only question after that opening joke is I wonder how many people my age would actually know who Mariah Carey even is, which is a sad state of affairs.
You seem pretty down on Mariah Carey.
Well, no, it's not that. It's just that whenever I hear her, I always think of like her movie appearances, and it's usually not good. Was that was her in that movie Glitter, right? What was that? Or am I thinking?
I believe she's in something like that. I didn't follow her career for the movies that she did.
Probably better off.
Some of the music in the 90s, the music videos and whatnot, when I was watching MTV back when I was a youth. That's where I know Mariah Carey from.
The MTV days, really. I was about to say that really puts a date on that one. Imagine actually being able to watch MTV on TV and not just on YouTube clips. Anyways, people, we're back with another episode of Talkin Thrones, Season 6, Episode 3. And as I like to say, this is the portion where stuff starts to happen, because Season 6, as we kind of covered the first 2 episodes, is a really interesting season where it seems like the season is both taking its time and speeding towards the finale, depending on what storyline you get. It's not nearly as egregious as Season 5, but I definitely can say that now we're 3 episodes in. I've been watching ahead a little bit for this season, which I haven't done with any previous seasons, since we're kind of fast tracking it and getting towards the finale. And yeah, my biggest thing is I'm like, wow, there are certain storylines that are pacing themselves perfectly. There are certain other storylines that are kind of taking a little bit long to get to the point, and other storylines where it's like, oh my God, like can we get to the point already? You are just dragging and taking its time. And I feel like this is the biggest example of that, because here, like I said, there are storylines that very much take their time, storylines that feel like they're rushing their conclusion, and storylines where it's like, okay, I guess this is paced just perfectly. We get a couple of new introductions. Like I said, this is also the season where we start to bring back everyone from the previous seasons in order to start to wrap things up. But Pat, first and foremost, we made a little boo-boo last week when we were talking about the Bran story arc.
I don't know if it's a boo-boo. I just totally jumped ahead and wanted to talk about the scene, the flashback in this episode 3, and I just went ahead and talked about it, throughout the whole episode last time. So it tells you that these Bran storylines don't really matter what episode they happen in, right? Because it's just giving us a glimpse of this whole time traveling, impact of how the Three-Eye Raven works in this universe. And, I guess I must have watched 2 episodes back to back when I was like tired or whatever, and sort of mixed what episode the scene was in. But we're talking about when young Ned Stark goes to the tower to basically, rescue his sister, Lyanna. So that sequence, we talked about it last week in episode 2, because I was so excited to really talk about it. Awesome sword fight. Awesome implication of like Bran and his ability to travel through time and, potentially have a little bit of a impact, on previous events, a little magical time travel element now added to the Game of Thrones universe. So, again, it's a great scene. I talked about it last week. Basically, I guess I watched 2 episodes back to back and just didn't keep them apart.
There's a reason why I definitely have to like watch these episodes like a week at a time, or if I do 2 back to back, it can only be 2, because man, these storylines really start to blend together as far as that goes. But you raise an interesting point as far as the Bran storylines, where what's so fascinating about Bran's arc this season, it's the first time that we get him back after an entire season of him missing, as we complained many times about during the events of season 5. And now that we get him back, it's always fascinating to me, like, how they're able to almost like perfectly pace it where you get really only 2 episodes of him doing the flashbacks. The one flashback last week, which as it turned out was actually of him witnessing, his family when they were younger, young Lyanna, young Ned, young Benjen, and as is revealed, young Hodor, or as he was known back then, Willis, but also and how that sets up for the Hodor reveal, but also, the flashback to the Tower of Joy, famously, an event that has been told to us, that is a very crucial formative moment during the war, during the original war, Robert and Ned's rebellion, during Ned's upbringing, obviously, as is, this is the moment where they officially kind of set up and start to lend some credence to the famous R+L=J theory, which is famously for the longest time, the book readers had this theory that Jon Snow obviously was not Ned Stark's bastard, and that, in fact, he was actually Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark's bastard son. And the big thing about this scene is that this is the moment that kind of confirmed it. And that was another thing that kind of made season 6 so interesting to watch, both as the first season that took place post the events of the books, but also the first season that at first seemed to be lending credence to a lot of theories that have been circulating over the last 20 years roughly of Game of Thrones existence. And so it's really interesting that you get that setup here. As far as thematically what it serves, it doesn't really, I think, serve anything too different other than last week's flashback, which is that it's more so just the same of Bran wanting to stay in the past, Bran wanting to learn more, Bran not really concerned with, going back to the present. The Three-Eyed Raven kind of reminding him, yeah, no, this is your responsibility. You have to learn this stuff, but you can't get trapped in it because then you're kind of no use to everyone. Because, like, the whole role of Bran in the series, I think, has always been fascinating from a paper standpoint, where kind of you have it's funny, I was actually breaking the show down to a friend of mine yesterday who actually had never seen the show, and I was kind of breaking down like the main characters, right, as far as all the different archetypes and kind of where they started versus where they came to, and how they kind of were all a breakup of kind of the traditional fantasy, like, for lack of a better word, like monotonies. And the biggest thing for me was that Bran is kind of, for lack of a better word, like inheriting like the sorcerer / mentor role. You always have that thing in Campbell's storytelling of like, the ancient sorcerer, the one who knows all, the mentor figure, the intelligence figure that they have to go and get information from. And it's really interesting kind of seeing like how Bran represents the origin for that, as far as where he starts off as this little kid who everyone assumes is probably not going to be the heir because he's not the oldest, but he's, assumedly gonna grow up to inherit a position of importance, and then that's robbed of him when he loses the use of his legs, But it's really interesting how Martin kind of builds that up to where, okay, he's lost the use of his physical body, so now he has to make use of kind of this sorcery. And it's a really interesting and different and new, fascinating way to kind of mix the roles of sorcery into a world where, despite the fact that it's very clear that sorcery has had a major part in its history, it's almost like disregarded as not being real by those in power until it's like of convenience for them. And so that's always been a really fascinating part about Bran's usage. And I think that's probably the most fascinating part about like kind of now that we're finally getting to see like his real training begin after having been built up for so long,
Yeah. So obviously we're getting the training here in season 6. And, I've argued in the past that we should have gotten a little bit of Bran's training in season 5,
right?
That he shouldn't have totally just disappeared from that season. I think, maybe give us some flashbacks of, basically the Starks and the previous generation, Ned and all that stuff, and really give us the lay of the land of Bran sort of understanding his ancestry. The whole getting trapped, if we had season 5 where it was like he kept wanting to continue, and you can even add this like drawn out storyline where it's like, yeah, the real world being stuck in a miserable cave in the middle of, the north where it's snowing and whatever is depressing. You could have this sort of melancholy come over Bran, and, that's why he wants to stay in this world. And you could set up the whole storyline, where, these events get more and more interesting, where the Three-Eyed Raven is showing him more of his history, trying to get him to understand, for instance, who Jon Snow really is. And, as he sort of, expedites Bran's training, he still hasn't gotten over the whole idea of like not getting lost in there. And so there could be like a lot of cool tension and stuff like that in this storyline. And, again, I've argued that one of the things that we keep talking about on this podcast is we kind of want the novel type stories, right? We want depth. And in a TV show, you kind of only get glimpses, and things have to be expedited because there's only so much time per episode that they're allotted to put on television. So, as I understand where the storyline goes, basically it's streamlined. We get a glimpse of, like you said, Willis and who he is, and that he was kind of normal once, so to speak. And then you get the whole tower where Ned has the sword fight, and we realize that, Ned is a killer. He might not be as honorable as he has always appeared to be, that, there may be some secrets that he even or has held in the past. So we're getting these cool glimpses of some lore, and Bran, seeing how he reacts to it. And that's where it's going to go from there. Let's see where the storyline develops. To me, Bran is one of the most interesting characters of the show, and this is where his character really starts to pop off the screen, and it's like, yeah, give me more of that. And unfortunately, it's very subtle. They don't go too far into it. They kind of give us this magic, this time travel esque, sort of vision power, and then it just immediately jumps into him sort of with a showdown with the Night King, and going back and forth, and how they can sort of see each other in their visions and impact each other. The one scene that's coming up this season where the Night King actually touches him. It's this all stuff is all cool and everything, but ultimately, it just comes down to him sitting in a courtyard waiting for the Night King, and it's like, why did we build up this cool power?
The biggest thing, like you said, that kind of robs this storyline of, I feel like, a lot of its more coolness. Number one, like I said, the fact of where it builds to, the fact that what ultimately becomes is for Bran to kind of turn into like this emotionless blob that kind of just that is kind of just like a source of information when is needed, and then ultimately becomes king after being used as bait for the Night King. And it's like, okay, so all that power that you gain that was going to be of like this tremendous use, that there was a reason why, the Night King was always built up as kind of being this co-enemy, like in the physical world with Jon, but then in more of like the spiritual, kind of higher magical plane, that's where he was Bran's enemy, and Bran is ultimately used as bait. So it's ruined by that. Number two, the fact that when you really take a step back and look at it, all of the summation of Bran's awesome stuff really only comes down to roughly 4 episodes, because you get these 2 episodes of flashbacks, then he's not in the next episode. Then you have the door moment with the whole twist with Willis and the White Walker attack on the tree, where they basically, again, kill off the Three-Eyed Raven and all of the Children of the Forest, basically kind of eradicating that entire storyline. Using a little bit of the hard home techniques in order to just conveniently wipe out storylines off the board. And then it's also ruined by the fact, and then that as a result is ruined by the fact of, it's like, okay, what we got was cool, but we could have had so much more of it if we'd had this like sporadically used in moments throughout season 5, and then it results maybe in a moment of him potentially coming into contact with Theon, the famous moment from the book that is cut famously from the show, and then how that kind of builds in how maybe the consequences, very similar to how a lot of characters suffered some bad consequences of their actions at the end of season 5. Very similarly, you could see how that could maybe more so build into the Hodor twist and the ultimate White Walker attack that you see happen in episode 5, that unfortunately is kind of, in a way, as good as it is, rushed to in this season, ultimately.
Yeah, I'll say this is like, again, the Bran storyline, you talk about him being an emotionless blob at some point. And, that's true. It's kind of an aesthetic that they chose to go with him in after this season. I guess they didn't really know what to do with him, so they just kind of get him in a wheelchair. They kind of have him just stoically say what needs to be said. Like, obviously he can see past, present, and future to a certain degree, and so he has this omniscient sort of characteristic about him, and he utilizes that going forward. But I think getting there, earning that would have been great. Like a little bit of psychological terror of what it means to be trapped in these flashbacks, and what it means to have the Night King haunting your, if you think about it this way, Bran really has little going on in the physical world, and therefore he's got to live in these visions, and he gets to, walk again and hunt again and do all this type of stuff, experience either vicariously through other characters or just, himself. Like, he is a warg, so he can take control to a certain degree of things. and he can't get lost in that, right? But he's such a character that, and they kind of just like wipe this characteristic out of there. Is the fact is that he kind of wants to give into that, and I think that's very interesting. Where it's you have a character that wants to get lost and is sort of kind of ignoring the Three-Eyed Raven's instructions, but obviously the Three-Eyed Raven's not gonna let that happen. But once the Night King sort of starts terrorizing that space and understanding who Bran is, and really going after him, there could be this sense of loss. That he can only dip into these visions for only so much, because the Night King is going to be there and looming over him, and some of these visions can actually start off informative, but then become dark and cruel pretty quickly. And I think that could have been a cool aesthetic, some sort of psychological battle in this meta plane could have been something phenomenal in this show, which could have led to the standoff in the courtyard being actually a little more interesting, because of course Bran's going to be the bait at that point, because his world, his future as the Three-Eyed Raven is at risk. And I feel like the series, although it starts us off on this cool path line of making Bran the Three-Eyed Raven, it doesn't really pay off in the sense of him struggling to reach that status.
Yeah,
he sort of just becomes the Three-Eyed Raven, and that's it. That's how you become the Three-Eyed Raven. You just the previous one just shows you the ropes for like 10 minutes, and then you're good to go.
I feel like another big missed opportunity is, again, I mean, I know I've talked about this before, but seeing like if Bran was actually trying to do something other than just controlling some birds during that final flight. If he was like trying to there's a reason why he was literally right next to the Weir Tree. If it was using the Weir Tree in order to try and go back into the past and fight this battle on the Night King's mental front while everyone is fighting him physically, I think that would have made a big difference. And also just the idea, I don't know why this is kind of funny, but it always makes me chuckle whenever you see two people these with these powerful, really psychic abilities, but then you see them in the real world and they're usually just holding up their hands at each other as they're concentrating really hard, and I'm just man, we were robbed of seeing a simultaneously awesome yet hilarious moment just like that in this show.
Well, if you go back to David Cronenberg's Scanners, that's definitely one of the movies where it's they tilt, they tilt their head and they bulge their eyes. And,
it's great.
It's
great. The one guy when he's
popping
spasming out before his head explodes, pretty much the origin of how to accurately portray psychic abilities on screen.
Yeah, I feel like Brian De Palma also did a sort of psychic movie.
That wouldn't surprise me, because I feel like Brian De Palma and David Cronenberg kind of go hand in hand there.
Yeah, so go back to the 80s if you want to see some psychic battles.
Absolutely.
But it appears like Dom and I agree that maybe the Scanners type psychic battles should have taken place in the last couple seasons.
So if you're going to take nothing else from this episode, take this away. Watch David Cronenberg's Scanners. It's a great movie about
just imagine that's Bran.
Else. Yeah,
left and right. He's
and then the guy whose head explodes in that one scene is the Night King. Just imagine that. I feel like it would automatically solve a lot.
Or some of the White Walkers, he could come across some of the generals and take care of that. So there could have been multiple ways to take out White Walkers. Valyrian steel, dragon glass,
fire,
scanner power.
Exactly. It all works out. So we get a brief check-in with Sam on the Narrow Sea. Sam is used very sporadically this season. I think he only pops up 3 times. It's a quick scene. It's only there in order to kind of fulfill the Feast for Crows arc that they almost completely cut from season 5. And it's they're journeying south now. And now this is kind of the end of, for lack of a better word, Gilly's usefulness. Her and Sam, they had a pretty awesome kind of building their foundations arc going forward, and this is the time where Gilly's kind of only role in the show going forward is to point out certain little details that are going to be important going forward. Well, support Sam, but also point out strangely important details. She's the one that, ironically enough, stumbles upon the fact that Rhaegar annulled Elia Martell before marrying Lyanna Stark in secret, and the fact that she just kind of happens upon that as in a crazily important detail in the next season, but we'll get to that. It's a small scene. It's just there in order to kind of remind you, hey, Sam's still in the show, and just to remind you, Sam is seasick, and kind of fill it a little bit.
Well, it's kind of that slapstick comedy, right? Sam can't hold anything up or down, so to speak, and it's just all coming up, and he's having a conversation with Gilly, and it's kind of a humorous. This episode is pretty heavy, and now Sam is part of the comic relief, as he continues on his journey.
Nice. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, it's quick. There's a lot of quick moments that are kind of just set up for moments that are coming later on. And we'll cover that as we cover the next couple storylines.
This is also the scene where Sam tells Gilly that we're going to my family home, right? That's pretty much
pretty much the only thing that comes out. It's starting to set up Hornhill, setting up the rest of his family, and even though they're sporadically used, it's clearly more so set up for the next season. Like I said, it's a lot of setup that we get in this episode. Next scene, Winterfell. This is the big one. Ramsay. I will say that like the Winterfell stuff this season is in like complete polar opposite to me as far as how it was utilized last season, where last season it felt like we were spending way too much time there. It felt like it was just torturing us with the amount of obvious stuff that it was jamming down our throat. Now we're in, I think, a much better spot economic-wise, where it's just Ramsay is making moves. He's taking complete control of Winterfell, and now he's attempting to shore up his forces in order to prepare for the inevitable conflict. Because it's a weird thing that's established here, where after the Stannis defeat, both sides are kind of like in this weird standstill, where Ramsay and his forces are obviously doing everything that they can in order to try and get Sansa back, because she's who their claim to the north depends on. You have Jon, obviously, who obviously, as we'll later come to find out in the episode, has just come back to life. So he's in this really weird spot where he's not quite sure, obviously, what to do before Sansa kind of shows up there and kind of pushes these two on their collision course towards each other. But for right now, Ramsay's just in a position of he just killed his father, and now he's attempting to shore up his forces. He's bringing back some old sons of former Stark allies, famously Harold Karstark, one of the surviving sons of Rickard Karstark, who Robb executed way back in season 3 for his betrayal there. And then we also get the introduction of Small Jon Umber, who's the son of the Great Jon Umber, who we haven't seen since season 1. It was one of those weird casting decisions where he came in. He was like this really boisterous, loud force as one of like Robb's soldiers that he had to like gain his respect for. And then he kind of disappears after season 1 and is kind of replaced by Roose Bolton and Rickard Karstark. And so you don't even get to see his death, where famously that character dies at the Red Wedding. Or at least, in the books, his son does, ironically enough. But now you get his heir, Small Jon Umber, who is has this really interesting and fascinating decision with Ramsay, where he's almost like, yeah, I know you. I know your reputation. I don't like you. But because of this one thing that's happened, because of the wildlings that have been brought south, which I like that they're like continuing to emphasize how Jon bringing the wildlings south is not only just a drastic, detrimental decision, not only to the Night's Watch, but to the rest of the Northerners as well. And I like how we see at least a few of those continuing threads continue throughout this season. And I think it's pretty good motivation as far as that goes. It results in a rather humorous scene where Small Jon Umber is like, look, we've always been loyal to the Starks, but Jon Snow kind of betrayed that by bringing the wildlings south. We've always fought wildlings, but this is too many. So we obviously, we need to enter into an alliance of favor where we're both kind of helping out each other. And then in order to prove himself, obviously, to Ramsay, his allegiance, as he refuses to bow to Ramsay and swear allegiance to him, he brings out famously, we also haven't seen since season 3, Rickon Stark and Osha, who have famously been captured by the Umbers. I love how, too, it's like, obviously we know that, where we last left off with Osha and Rickon at the end of season 3 was where Bran was telling Osha to bring him to Last Hearth because he figured that the Umbers would be loyal enough to the Starks to look after them. And this shows that this is not at all the case. Unfortunately, the Starks have clearly been gone for too long. The Boltons have clearly had enough time now in order to solidify their claim in the North, especially after, as we later find out from the, oh my God, what's the other family that they attempt to reach? The Glovers. Once they reached out to the Glovers, that the Boltons have clearly had this time in order to kind of like get their roots in to a lot of the other northern houses, having helped them get rid of a lot of the Ironborn that had previously invaded the region, So it definitely helps to build up that Jon and Sansa are going to have a little bit of a tough fight to fight against, as they're not only going to be fighting against Ramsay, but also the rest of some of their former northern allies as well. So I don't know, what's your take on that whole scene?
My take on the whole thing is Ramsay just killed Roose.
Yeah.
And, this is my complaint.
And it definitely feels like everyone's taking it a little bit too much in stride.
Yeah, it's pretty much just like, yeah, okay, I guess you're in charge now.
Yes.
And obviously, maybe the scene where it's like, I'm not willing to bow to you, I'm not willing to do this. Like, maybe that has to do with the fact that, there's sort of this, did really Roose get poisoned, or did Ramsay kill him? But it's not really openly addressed in terms of the story. And, I feel like Roose dying sets up a little more splintering in the North than Ramsay should, and he should be worried about it. But in this sequence, I kind of have mixed feelings about it because it seems like he enters quite easily into new alliances. Obviously he's not going
it's like,
to.
man, people really do not have a good grasp of like the reputation of the Bastard of Winterfell, because like that's always the one thing I will say. Again, it like kind of lends to Ramsay being very sporadically used in the books because he was presented much more so as this force to be reckoned with. Like he was able to have this like really widespread bout of fear. It also probably helped in the books as well that he still, for the most part, had the allegiance to the phrase, which is all but completely been lost now after having fed his mother-in-law or his former mother-in-law or former stepmother rather to his hounds.
Yeah. So also it's so the guy's not willing to kneel to him. So there's kind of a little bit of disrespect there to a certain degree. It's
right.
Like most bannermen do kneel. So maybe what they plan to get out of this is like Ramsay's going to end up the warning on the North, but ultimately maybe at the end of the day, once all the threats are taken care of and the North is kind of its own thing, maybe there's a little more fracturing of the North than there was under the Starks.
Right.
And so maybe that's really what the Uneasy Alliance is about. But what I will say is that this is where the show really kind of streamlines this stuff, and it really doesn't go into detail. Like this is the type of stuff that I want to know about, is just really what the allegiances are, and like why is someone willing to team up with Ramsay when they know that he's sort of a killer and he's totally not trustworthy. What obviously you're telling me that the Wildlings being brought south below the wall is a big enough reason, and maybe that is, but it's not necessarily like a lot of these families are really bringing that cause up, and they're not showing us these scenes. We only get glimpses of it, and I think would be better, in my opinion, to really have more in depth of these, interactions between other members of the North, and really them picking a side between Ramsay and Jon.
100%. And you see like a little bit of that in the episodes going forward. But I guess for me, a bigger justification rather than kind of the flimsy excuse of the Wildlings, which I do agree is a little bit of a flimsy excuse, because even as he says, it's like as Umber says, he's like, look, we're the ones that always have to deal with the Wildlings first. We can fight Wildlings, but that's too many of us for us to deal with. So we kind of have to marshal our forces against them. And so that kind of makes sense. But I think a much bigger justification and reasoning for it is the fact that Ramsay was able to take down Stannis so easily. And that's like a big blow, because Stannis was a southern king who attempted to come up here, at least in the eyes of the rest of the Northerners, and take out the Boltons. And despite the reputation that Ramsay has, he is still a Northerner, and the Northerners have always had, and that's kind of sort of a thing that they get into that is kind of that was emphasized a little bit last season, that they start to get into much more so this season once you start to bring in a lot of the other Northern houses, which is the Northerners have always held themselves in like kind of this greater isolation, where they always look at themselves almost like this separate nation from the South. Obviously we know it was Robert and Ned's friendship that kind of held the kingdoms together throughout all that realm of peace. And then obviously, once Joffrey took Ned's head and the rising up of the North, and then their subsequent defeat by the rest of the South. And obviously, you've had the Boltons there in order to kind of hold control over everything. But it does goes to show where, again, the Northerners, they're descended from the First Men. They're not descended from the Andals like the rest of Westeros are. The entirety of the North is bigger than the other six kingdoms combined. So the Northerners have always held themselves as being very territorial in that sense, and very, kind of sticking together, and to a point where like some of the rationale doesn't necessarily make sense. And it shows also that they are human beings. And even though they have always kind of had this higher sense of honor to them than a lot of the other Southerners, they still very much do like kind of value where the power is. And they understand that like, look, the Starks have been dead for years now, and now you have the one bastard son who is bringing down the Wildlings versus, the strongest, the newest current presiding house in the North that just defeated the last of the Southern kings, the last of the, the rebellions. Stannis was the last of the original 5 kings, and now he's gone too. So that's kind of to me where I can sort of justify it, even if you're right. A little bit of the semantics of it don't necessarily make sense, but you're right. This is definitely where.
I don't think they're going to show us, the reasons why Ramsay gets his allegiances pretty quickly. I think you brought up a good point where Ramsay basically defeated Stannis. And, that could have been something where they brought that up. Like, Roose is sort of the leader, and maybe he's overshadowed by Ramsay and his involvement in taking out Stannis. Maybe that's where Ramsay could sort of
because the other thing
have the opportunity to usurp Stannis.
Right, because the other thing too is that Harold Karstark was literally in the room with Ramsay and Roose, with Ramsay just kills Roose, and he kind of just bats an eye and doesn't even really do anything. Partially because it's like, okay, what can I do? If I say anything against this guy's gonna kill me. Versus, part two is like, or I could kind of just assert my position really and show where my loyalties lie here. So like I said, it's primarily set up, especially for the next episode, because after next episode, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think we see Ramsay again until the Battle of the Bastards. So like I said, it's really just Ramsay is asserting his dominance, asserting his power, shoring up his defenses, making alliances where he needs to, crazily enough, playing the game, which is, again, shows a little bit of character development after just watching him as a sadistic psychopath kind of do whatever he wanted for the past couple of seasons. So it's definitely interesting.
The last thing I want to say about this is I feel like when Roose gets assassinated, I think it would have been a better scene if he's having a council meeting of his allies, in the north. And essentially, the allies are giving credit to Ramsay, and, there is a general betrayal of Roose by everybody. And, Ramsay is able to kill, Roose pretty easily. And then everybody sort of accepts him as the new sort of hero of the North, the person that they're willing to work with. I think there's just, in terms of, I guess I'm stuck on this. It just seems like, hey, let's just start killing people willy-nilly. But I feel like there could have been something tighter story-wise to really cement Ramsay as this figure that is in control of the North. Whether it be like the concerns about the Wildlings are brought up and Roose doesn't seem to think that's a problem, that would give them a reason to sort of betray him, or at least keep the secret of his death, there. So, I don't know. I think a little more details here, just a little interesting story building would have been appreciated in this sequence.
100%.
Again, we're going to get a great battle and fight sequence by the end of the season. So,
and that's pretty much all
that's a moot point.
Yeah, and that's pretty much all that this season really cares about. So let's move on to a brief touch-in with King's Landing. I like what I see here. It's a funny sequence, although it doesn't really result in anything. The biggest thing is that, we get one meeting. You get one meeting in order to kind of like show that Varys, that Qyburn, I should say, is kind of essentially taken over Varys' spot as kind of Master of Whisperers in King's Landing. It's interesting kind of how he's interacting with all of Varys' previous little birds, kind of like, providing the problem solver, that mentality, and then obviously Jaime, Cersei, and Sir Gregor arriving and kind of showing that, like, okay, this is how Qyburn is essentially, going to utilize himself and make himself of even more use to Cersei, kind of indoctrinating himself there after, the whole Sir Gregor taking out the one regular person last week who was also, talking some nasty stuff about Cersei just in general. But it's followed up by the small council meeting scene, which, again, these scenes are constantly more and more frustrating to me as time goes on, because I don't understand the purpose for them, because literally all this is to me is more of a repeat of where we were at the beginning of season 5, where to me it's constantly been the flaw of the entire King's Landing arc of the last 2 seasons, which is the only reason why we are here, the only reason why Cersei felt the need to go to the Sparrows in the first place and get all this nonsense started was because of Kevin not pledging his allegiance to her. And now they are literally in the same spot. They both have this hatred of the Sparrows, obviously, that there's been this great I can't even think of I could never think of the word for it. This great, let's call it sense of injustice that's been committed against Cersei, and they are still bickering about like what position she's in. It's like Cersei clearly wants the same thing as you guys. Can you not put aside your petty differences for 5 seconds where she's sitting down and she's like, look, we need to kind of come to a head of this thing, like they keep mentioning Prince Trystane and Dorne as if the show actually still cares about Dorne, which they clearly don't. And they clearly just want to brush that off and move on. And the other big thing, obviously, is where it's like, oh, well, you're right. We can't make you leave, but you cannot prevent us from us leaving, And I'm just like, well, what is the point of this? I'm like, could you imagine what would happen if you could actually like just put your heads together for 5 seconds and actually like work together, especially since that's exactly what they do in the next episode. So I don't know. Just I have a little bit of a problem. I've always had a problem with the usage of Kevin, mostly because, again, there's really no reason for it is the thing. I guess just in the sense of where Cersei is coming off as a lot more bloodlustful and power hungry and not really knowing what she's doing in the books versus in the show. Cersei was always trying to do what she thought was best as a ruler, and there was never really any big reason to really go against that, you know?
Yeah, I agree with you that this sequence, it doesn't really change anything. It really kind of, like you said, just has them treading the same ground. And I will say that, we before, kind of when Tyrion was in King's Landing, we enjoyed those scenes of the small council. But I feel once Tyrion sort of leaves King's Landing, any of the small council scenes don't really play out that well. It kind of, the magic of those scenes has dissipated. In this sequence here, it's basically just, Cersei, Jaime, asserting their power, and obviously the ground that they stand on is still volatile. So I think, that's really the only information we get in this story. And, maybe, the fact that they walk out on them is, something that tells the viewer like, oh man, they're in a bad spot. But ultimately, yeah, this sequence is very minor. It kind of just ensures that King's Landing is in this episode. And yeah, we're gonna have to move on.
Yeah.
It's like we're gonna start the storyline with Tomlin. I basically talking with the Sparrow, right?
Right. The only other big thing, like I said, is the Tommen talking with the High Sparrow and kind of like him trying to like commit him to force him to release Margaery, and then the High Sparrow started to get into Tommen's ear. Like, there's a lot of political maneuvering that's going on behind the scenes here, both with the High Sparrow's conversations and slow manipulation of Margaery, which we'll also see a lot of happen in the next episode, as well as the beginning of the sequence with Tommen. Because as we see also in the next episode, we know that that's also when Tommen reveals to Cersei the High Sparrow's plans for Margaery's Walk of Penance, as well as Cersei's trial by combat, which obviously we now know is the High Sparrow's means of kind of manipulating Cersei through Tommen, which I think is really interesting, but is covered more so in the next episode. So
yeah, I think what would have made this scene better in the small council is if they openly argued about, Cersei using Tomlin to, and obviously
right.
poorly using the Faith Militant to sort of, cause like these petulant games amongst the members there, because you have the Tyrells there and they're impacted just as much as Cersei was by, the High Sparrow's decisions. And, they could have openly discussed that and, argued and basically been like, what are you doing? And, one of the accusations that could have came out is like, we need to all agree whoever is the last person that talks with Tomlin is going to basically, get him to make decisions, right? He's easily controllable.
Right.
And that should be something that comes out at the small council, and how dangerous that is. And like, if we keep fighting over his ear and manipulating him, a lot of bad things are going to happen. And then you can cut to this scene where he, the High Sparrow is talking to Tomlin, and that would be cool. I think that would build a little drama, where it's like, it's an open secret that Tomlin can be manipulated.
Right.
And then here comes the High Sparrow to really start, bringing some of that manipulation from the Faith into his ear.
Absolutely. It's not really exactly like crazy stuff that's too far out of the realm of possibility, at least of what they did before. It's what constantly makes me question why they don't choose to go with these decisions more so. It's not like I personally don't think that it would change or impact the show necessarily. If anything, I feel like it would make it more complex and interesting. But
yeah, I know we're looking back, right? Like I said, This is like our third time going through the series. So, obviously we thought a little bit about how you can tweak things here and there. As you're developing a show, you sort of have deadlines and, production restrictions in terms of like what your budget is and, how much time you got to, per episode, right. And you got to be economical here. So, I can understand like why the show isn't perfect. But, I think when you're reviewing the show and being critical about it, the focus towards the end of the series is definitely on those, big battles and big moments. And, some of the nuance within these scenes, is sort of left for the audience to decide. And, I think they could have been a little more on the point. And here's a good example. It's like they could have talked about the manipulation of Tomlin and how that's a problem, and then, escalate that problem by having the High Sparrow then talk to him. And, that would have been a pretty awesome thing to do in terms of the stakes of this storyline.
I definitely get the sense that, especially, obviously starting with season 5, even though this season I think is a much bigger improvement over season 5 than is a much needed improvement over season 5, I should say. I definitely still get the sense that with seasons 2 through 4, they were like constantly working on all of the scripts for the next couple seasons, working on the storylines, working and seeing where they were going to go all the way up until season 4. And then I feel like starting with season 5, they started really only like kind of coming up with the scripts to build up to the like whatever the big moment for that season was going to be, and then kind of just like writing and then just kind of going along with the scripts per year as time went on, because it definitely feels, even with this season, which again is a vast improvement over season 5, it definitely still feels that way, where it feels like they're writing these scripts weekly. It doesn't feel like there's as much thought put into some of the smaller moments when there very well could be, even though the moments they make slightly more sense. But yeah, I digress. So let's cut to Essos. We cut in quickly with Daenerys in Vaes Dothrak before we spend even more time with Tyrion and Meereen. But the biggest thing that's established in the Vaes Dothrak scene is she meets up with the former Khaleesi's. They kind of emphasize, kind of what it is that she did when she went out into the world, and, kind of what she's going to face. She's essentially going to face another trial. There's a lot of trials this season. I'm realizing that now, but for some reason they don't feel nearly as fruitful or as important as the last couple, But it's basically just being like.
Well, apparently what I've gathered from this scene was the Culls are, basically are gathering, and they're going to make a decision, based on her just, going out into the world instead of, going to this retirement home, so to speak. Basically it seems like she's, going to be sentenced to death, right, from what the conversation is.
Certainly
here.
Seems that way.
And that only her fellow Khaleesi's that are here can really help her, and basically how she interacts with them, and if she can prove herself as worthy of being part of this group and find a place, like there's a sense, the lead woman here basically gives her the sense that, if we find value in you, we can probably steer the direction of this decision. And that's really the bare minimum of this sequence. I don't know what else there is.
Yeah, there's really not much else to do other than kind of the majesty of seeing Vaes Dothrak again for the first time since season 1. Like I said, it's another thing that's really just setting up for next episode where we get a majority of the action. The only thing, like you said, that's really established here is the fact that it kind of her relation that she forms with the rest of these former Khaleesi's is all going to determine kind of, what the outcome of the trial will be. But it's already apparent that she has other plans. Now, unfortunately, we have to cut back to my favorite storyline of this season, Meereen, the Dorn of this season, where
Meereen is interesting because it starts off with Tyrion.
You use that word
and his jokes, right? It's basically, hey, let's play a game, let's do this, and
more of the jokes.
Well, the whole idea is that Tyrion is sort of this drunk, talker, right? And he's with Grey Worm and and Nasande, and basically the two of them are not really talkers, right? And so it's the three of them sitting in a room, and Tyrion's trying to be joyful and be like, hey, let's drink. We don't drink, hey, let's do this. But whatever, it's basically, it's not working. And
they're trying to play off like the funny Bran pod dynamics that he had in King's Landing back in season 2, and it's not working. It's not the same. It comes off as really awkward, really forced. And it would be one thing if it was just kind of like, I feel like if anything, a better sequence is the fact that they don't really know each other that well, and they don't really find anything that they can get along with, where they're both kind of just sitting there awkwardly in silence, where it's and so Tyrion kind of like just constantly trying to break the tension just comes off as forceful, and it doesn't help the fact that it's compounded with again, Varys is back this season and he's trying to be as useful as he can, but it doesn't help that he's pointing out stuff that is so beyond obvious to us, the audience, where he brings in the woman who is assisting in a lot of the Sons of the Harpy attacks from last season, and it's a pretty good build-up, obviously, to getting her to reveal the information, where he's like, I could have you tortured, but who knows if the information you'll give us is actually accurate. So instead, I'm gonna let's call you. I'm gonna kill you with kindness, if you will. I'm gonna get you and your son I'm going to subtly threaten your son, but I'm also going to arrange for a safe passage for you guys to Pentos if you tell me what I need. It's a pity that what he needs to find out.
The best line is, "Oh, I have a bag of gold, but we're gonna have to ask the soldiers in to carry it because there's no way that neither of us could do it." You know, like the amount of money.
Constantly just emphasizing just how long he's been in the lap of luxury.
Yeah, so the amount of money that he's willing to bribe this woman to set her up with a new life for her and her son, it's a great moment because it gives us the viewer like, oh my God, how much money is he giving her?
Right.
He's working to get that information that they so desperately need, which is how is this rebellion sustained? And at the end of the day, Varys is doing all the hard work while everybody else is sitting, in a parlor.
Yeah, if anything, it makes that scene even more awkward and forced than just insert. But it doesn't help that it kind of builds up to, again, one of the most obvious things you could possibly get, where he's like, who's funded the Sons of the Harpy? Oh, the Wise Masters of Astapor, the Something Masters of Yunkai, and then the Slave Masters of Volantis. It's like, really? We had no idea. There's no way we could have possibly figured that out for ourselves, where it's like, the Slave Masters who took back Astapor and Yunkai twice, I should say, from Daenerys, and who have every active reason to hate Daenerys and want her out of the city. It's like, it's like you could, because there's so much more room for intrigue here and suspense, where it would be really fascinating if the person who was funding the Sons of the Harpy wasn't the most obvious possible place, but it just kind of ruins it. It doesn't add any intrigue to it, and if it's only meant to like potentially build up to where, Tyrion's going to have a chance because Tyrion's a negotiator, not in the way that Daenerys was. So he'll actually have a chance of negotiating with them. And then, we see what happens with the rest of that next season. Like I've been saying, with everything that really happens in Meereen this season, it's stupid, it's boring, it's pointless, it's telling us stuff that we already know, and it's just spinning its wheels until the Battle of the Bastards, when Daenerys comes back with the dragons and roasts everyone. I hate it. I really don't want to talk about it any more than we already do, because it's already...
it's like we said, there's a couple storylines that get really put on the back burner, and they were just given enough to coast us along. Like I said, I think King's Landing with the High Sparrow, like that storyline over season 5 and 6 really just coaxed us over those 2 seasons. Something has to be happening in King's Landing, and there's, to me, that storyline, King's Landing, ends up in a spot which is totally awesome. Like, I like the climax of that storyline. Although us having to live through some of the, scenes from episode to episode, I could pass on a lot of them.
Especially because when it feels like the writing is just not as strong in the build up to those moments as opposed to how it was before, where before the writing was so strong in its build up to those sequences, versus now where the writing is just like kind of just literally spinning its wheels and trying to pass the time until we get to those moments.
But also comparatively, the stuff with Daenerys and Meereen, that doesn't really, end in a very climactic, awesome way.
Right.
Like, yeah, sure, there's the dragons burning down the master ships, and they basically get them to surrender. And, our hero, Daenerys in this case, wins the day. That's where we want that storyline to end. But ultimately, the sequence we get is not like this amazing moment. What Cersei does, to the Citadel is amazing. What Daenerys does to the Slave Masters is kind of routine.
Yeah.
So there's a difference in those storylines where, we need to give Daenerys something to do, but we're going to reward the fans with some sort of payoff. And I don't think that payoff at the end of the season is necessarily the one that we want.
I agree. And it's kind of in a strange way, like it's so strange to me how everyone seems to forget that about the Battle of the Bastards, where the Battle of the Bastards, obviously everyone remembers the Battle of the North, which is awesome and rightfully so and should be remembered. But I feel like everyone kind of conveniently forgets about how kind of boring and standard and routine the Daenerys half of that episode is. So I don't know. Like we'll get to that more when we cover Battle of the Bastards, but it's constantly a flaw of it in that episode for me that constantly weighs it down. It stops it from being the best episode, one of the best episodes of the show, because the truth is that it's really only half of a fantastic episode. So we have one more storyline before we cover the part where it's I'm
getting
Braavos,
the sense
the House of Black and White.
I'm getting the sense that neither of us really enjoyed this episode because, it's
well, aside from the
we're
stuff that happens in the
streamlining
wall,
through
the stuff
these
with
scenes.
Bran, but again, it's because it's all streamlined stuff. It's more the stuff that we didn't like about season 5, where again, two fantastic premiere episodes, and then it's kind of just spinning its wheels until it gets to like some slightly more awesome middle point episodes until the finale.
So I'll describe the Arya sequence as little words as possible, right? Arya learns her lesson. She gets her eyesight back.
Yeah, pretty much. And she has some more,
right?
some more fighting sequences where she she tells the wave some more of her history, and they introduce like the ambiguity that she had when killing the Hound, and that's about it. Like I don't really.
Well, here's the thing that could be interesting about this is that she's revealing so much information about who Arya Stark is,
right?
And they're kind of coasting it out of her. This is where the muddiness of this storyline is. Now, is it they're trying to extract all the information out of her so that, they could actually use her face and they could implant, sort of, they could just, use her face and go in and, basically assassinate who needs to be assassinated in Westeros? Or, is she really moving towards like becoming one of them? And, I don't think that's part of the storyline that they really go down, but it's very interesting that you're showing us like this idea that they're trying to like steal her identity. They're trying to make her no one.
It's very clear that that's the intent of the storyline. And once again, it's a thing where if they just focused on it a little bit more in the writing sense, this might have actually been really interesting. Where this season in particular, you don't really know whether Arya's loyalty is going to be to her origin or to the Faceless Men, and almost kind of how the Faceless Men are using her origin almost against her in order to coax her into more so becoming no one. And I think it could have made the finale and the resolution of the Braavos arc that we got this season even more fascinating. But once again, like everything else, it feels streamlined over, and it ultimately feels like they kind of make the choice without actually making the choice, where they have Arya openly reject the Faceless Men, but then they hunt her down. She kills the one assassin, goes back to the temple, essentially tells them, hey, you're not going to chase me anymore. I am no one. I've learned from you guys. They kind of just let her go. And then she spends the rest of the series in this half weird, like, oh, she's loyal to her family, but she also could be a Faceless Man. And it's like, it's so weird how it results. And
yeah, like one of the things that I think would be interesting to clarify this story is, Jack and Hagar met her in Westeros, and, at Harrenhal, she outsmarts him, and then he has to kill people, that he's not really destined to kill, right?
Right.
And so, if you can imagine, he escapes and he kind of goes back to Braavos, and maybe the Faceless Men kind of catch wind of this, and the real Jack and Hagar is sort of, because of his abuse of power, he's sort of, imprisoned or whatever they do. And so when Arya arrives, the Jaqen that she sees is just another Faceless Man. And we kind of get that with the whole idea of her pulling the masks off the face, and she keeps pulling it off. We kind of get that sense, and then now you have this darker storyline of them trying to steal her identity. And, it never really was about the place that Jaqen told her it would be. There's a more nefarious force here, and it would be cool if she stumbled upon like a prison and found the real Jakar, and like, he's like dying. There could have been something more to this storyline, to really show us like how in danger she was, and, and really amp the whole idea, like, if the many-faced god wants someone killed, that's who you're going after. But if they're not on, the many-faced gods sort of list, like you're going against them.
And once again, they tried to get that across, but I don't think they did a very good job of it, where it's like,
it would be totally awesome. Like I guess there's glimmer of what this storyline could have been.
They sort of do it because they have Arya forge this connection with this completely new ancillary character that we've never really seen before, but she grows attached to them and thinks that she's a good person. And so as a result, when kind of the Faceless Men reveal themselves as essentially nothing more than like a glorified sorceress bounty hunting troop. That's rather than like kind of this righteous cause that she thinks she's devoted herself to. That's when kind of the problems start to arise. That's where her problem of her crisis of conscience comes in. But like I said, I don't know. It doesn't really feel like, I think, a proper fulfillment to the arc. I feel like it was trying to aim for something a lot deeper, and then like so many of the other storylines are like, okay, we have to streamline this. We have to move on because we need Arya back in Westeros to fight against the Night King for whatever reason. I have no idea, especially since it doesn't really seem like she uses a whole lot of her faceless men tactics to fight against the Night King. But I don't know. Like I said, like many other stories,
we'll see how it goes as we watch these episodes. But again, watching it.
Anyway, so we'll move on to the last storyline of the episode, which is basically where what's it called? And arguably,
sorry about that.
Yeah, and arguably probably the only good moment of the entire season, which is Jon coming back to life and the kind of the immediate after effects of it, like kind of the only good moment of this episode, really, I should say, as I digress, because it seems like aside from everything going on with Jon and Bran, it feels like there's a lot of just stuff that kind of just like is a little bit more of a waste of time, at least this episode, than originally thought. But Jon's back. It opens and closes the episode. He wakes up off the table. I think it's really weird how the episode opens on Davos, just like the really super close up of his face as he's just breathing heavily as Jon gets up off the table before he like obviously helps him as he tries to get up. And like, I don't really know like what exactly the point of that is, but like it's shot really well. Like kind of, again, it's held out for suspense. I love the conversation that he has with each of the characters where Melisandre, she wants to just focus on the religious things. She's like, what did you see when you died? And Jon's like, nothing. And then Davos is like, forget all that. You're back. This kind of happened. Let's move on. You've got more fights to win, because obviously, you're back for a reason. You're back because everyone kind of believes in you ahead of time. Tormund kind of like emphasizes this belief that like, wow, they kind of, everyone there, the Night's Watch and the Wildlings kind of view him as this Messiah-like figure now, that he as the one who's come back from the dead. Even though it's not said until next episode, Melisandre is very much of the mindset of, wow, Jon is definitely the prince that was promised, unlike Stannis' way originally thought it was going to be. But let's talk about it though. The real thing that this is building to, that final moment with the with the hanging sequence where Jon hangs all the soldiers. That for me is like what makes this entire episode. I remember when this happened, obviously everyone was giving a lot of credit to the makeup job, specifically on the hanging sequences and how really scarily accurate that makeup was on all the dead bodies, obviously, once they were hung on Sir Alliser, Olly, and the other two Night's Watch members that they're hung. I definitely think it's a little weird that Jon only hangs those four, when I'm like, yeah, there were definitely other Night's Watch members that stabbed you. So I don't know what that says, that you're just giving them a pass, or if it's just the fact that they only had so much room in order to be able to hang that many guys. But it's a fantastic scene. It really is. It just once again emphasizes kind of all of the the last, I call this sequence the dying of the last of the moral gray area, because like I said, Jon's relationship with Sir Alliser, tenuous as it was in the last couple seasons, was always one of fascination, because Sir Alliser was kind of like an unlikely mentor figure for Jon, despite the fact that he hated him so much, because Sir Alliser's kind of stance on leadership and what that really meant, obviously, going all the way back to Watchers of the Wall, was something that really had an effect on Jon, and it was definitely something that he kind of took to heart, going towards this point. So if anything, that's what kind of makes this death almost bittersweet, rather than kind of being the justified end that this character deserves,
So, yeah, I will say, like, definitely I agree with you that there's not as many Night's Watchmen that perpetrated the betrayal, on Jon.
That are on trial here. It's like there were definitely more than those four guys that stabbed. There were like a couple of, I counted at least like 8 or 9,
Yeah, so there's one of two things. Like, we have to either believe that, all the people necessary got executed, whether they were killed when the Wildlings sort of stormed Castle Black. And maybe that's possible. Maybe these were the 4 or 5 people that still remained after the Wildlings kind of captured. Maybe there's a lot of or off-screen deaths. So we can believe that, that could have happened. Or, the other belief is that, Jon decided that I'm going to take out, the ones that I think are the biggest threats. Alliser obviously being the one that perpetrated the sort of betrayal. And some of his like right hand
Owen Marsh and
folks,
Yarwick, who are kind of just on his right hand, only kind of go along
exactly.
with whatever he
and then Olly is the only one that sort of stands out there, but like Olly is a young, hateful character, so basically
kind of better to do this now than leave him alive and see what could happen.
So basically, it's kind of would be a hard decision for Jon to make, but it's almost like, Olly is this unredeemable character, and it's like he has to go because he just doesn't know enough of the world. He's never going to fit into the Night's Watch. He was easily manipulated into joining this betrayal. Like, there could be so many reasons, and it could show us, like, again, they don't actually do this in the show, but it could show us like how, dark of a mindset that Jon has gotten to. And so, I think it's one of those things where you either just kind of believe that all the people that perpetrated the betrayal against Jon were executed, and that's, you just take it on faith that they were killed off screen if they weren't hanged in this episode. Or, what I think, again, could have been a cool thing is if they, showed you just like how precision Jon was in his decisions. Give him reasons for each of the person that he took out in this sequence, and Olly being probably the toughest choice. That could have been a cool moment because, they're asking him, like, are you the same person in there? And that's one of the things that is an interesting question.
That, of course, they then choose to just never bring up again.
Exactly. So, but like, if are you the same person in there? Like, why are you putting Olly up on the thing? Like, that's right. That's kind of like you're murdering a young kid,
right.
Like, and essentially Jon can have a justified kind of clear reasoning for doing so. And, something that, obviously the others are not going to argue against, but maybe they don't feel comfortable with it. And, the executions happen, and then Jon hands over the Lord Commander position, and that's one of those things where, it could add a little bit of complexity to the scene. Why did Jon choose to execute all these people and then hand off the commandership?
Right.
And like, clearly he wanted to put that kind of part of his life behind him. His watch has ended, as he says at the end of the episode, and he's ready to move on to what his real destiny is now that he has a second chance at life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where I love the back and forth between him and Sir Alliser right before Sir Alliser dies, where he says, look, it's like, I just pray that I could have made the right decision, that I would have had the strength to make the right decision again, knowing that this would be my outcome. Because obviously he tries to play off the idea that's like, oh, I only did this because I thought that, I would win. Obviously, I kind of, nobody really counted on you coming back to life, which again I thought was a little bit of a stupid decision because Melisandre was already back at the wall by that point. So it's like, she's a red priestess. You really have had, like, you were in King's Landing, or like you were a knight. You have no idea of what the red priestesses are capable of. Like, it was very clearly being talked about that, like, they were trying to buy their time until they could get Melisandre to bring Jon back. But like you said, it's interesting because for me, in a strange way, this is the last moment where Jon is an interesting character, because Jon spends the rest of the series from this point on kind of just becoming a passive character and kind of just doing what everyone else tells him to do, because he even says that he's fully ready to just walk away and leave the fight of the fight against the dead and the fight against the Boltons to pretty much everyone else. And it's Sansa that is the one that kind of has to coax him into really taking up an effort again next episode. The following season, he goes to Daenerys, obviously, because they need allies against the White Walkers. But then come the final season, he's pretty much just doing Daenerys's bidding now. It's like, I don't know. Like, I like the implications of where they could go. The ideas, like so many other things we've talked about, are there as far as, this could potentially be like another really rich and interesting point in Jon's story forward. The fact that he has come back from the dead, the fact that he could potentially be a completely different character than the Jon Snow that we've spent the past 5 seasons with getting to know. The fact that this is also clearly, the idea in the books was to potentially bring him back as like being more warg-like, where the idea being that because Jon in the books is a warg in addition to Bran, the idea that Jon would have warged into Ghost when he died, and then when he's brought back as a result, he kind of is more wolf-like in his personality, to the point where he literally is a different person. And the fact that they kind of just really don't go into that, and they kind of just like, okay, so now Jon is just going to spend the rest of his time just being told what to do by other people. I don't know. It's kind of the death of, like, the interesting character, one of the 8 focus characters of the show. And again, one of the most interesting characters that's had probably one of the most fascinating and interesting arcs on the show going forward. So as awesome as this moment was, there was something a little bit bittersweet about this moment kind of after the fact, knowing that, Jon is trying to put this part of his life behind him, but also in a strange way, like trying to put being an interesting character behind him,
I think you're right. Watching this episode, I am amped to see Jon really finally have an open opportunity to pursue his destiny the way it was intended, right? So since season 1 all the way up until this moment, he is delegated to the Night's Watch and honor and really upholding that belief system of Ned Stark, right? He took the oath, and now that he's died and been brought back, he's no longer bound to that, right? His watch is over because of his death, and now he has a second opportunity. And it's a great moment to sort of leave on right here in this episode, and throughout the season, he's going to be chasing his destiny. But like you have said, as things develop in season, the end of season 6, 7, and ultimately 8, that sort of storyline for him maintaining his destiny and becoming, one of the main contenders for that Iron Throne, it really does, as we'll see as we review the final seasons, kind of gets muddled. So,
a little bit. They have a chance.
It's an awesome moment, but it's knowing what happens, we're kind of like, oh, is that really what this
they have a
does?
chance to me. They had a chance, I should say, to redeem it in season 7, when obviously I think you could have saved. I think season 7 was the last moment where he was an interesting character, because season 7, what's so interesting is, despite kind of, it's a little bit of a shift where, so he was fully willing to just leave the fight of the dead and just go off and be a wanderer, until Sansa kind of coaxed him into leading the forces in order to take back Winterfell and essentially like kind of take on this role as King of the North. And season 7, there's a chance where he is taking all the goodwill that he has built up with the Northerners, kind of, reestablishing the trend as Ned Stark's true son, Ned Stark's true heir, the new King of the North, of the Avenger of the Red Wedding, all of that, and his victory over the Boltons. And he kind of is, and the fact that he's still willing to do exactly what he did with the Night's Watch and alienate his entire relationship with the Northerners in order to go south and forge this relationship with Daenerys and the Unsullied and the Dothraki, because he knows that they would be able to use those forces in the fight against the dead. And they have a chance to make that interesting, especially once it's revealed that he is a contender for the Iron Throne, and then they kind of just do away with it, and he kind of just, it results in him just once again being the reluctant hero and like, oh, I don't want it. Oh, I'm loyal to Daenerys, until he ultimately isn't. So I don't know. That to me is really where it goes downhill and ultimately kind of wrecks a lot of his other potential. But we shall see as we're tracking the rest of Jon's arc throughout the rest of the season, and whether the rest of the season kind of falls victim to maybe some of the tropes and tricks that season 5 did well, versus, still being able to maintain some of the awesome trajectory that it did from the first 2 episodes. But that's it. That's our recap review of season 6, episode 3, Oathbreaker. Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments section on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. If you're listening to it on there, be sure to also subscribe to us on YouTube and Twitch. Be sure to follow us across all of our social medias, including this guy over here at Patrick W. Huber. Follow myself at Movie Nerd Reviews across all platforms. And as always, people, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.